There are moments in your life that function like a developer fluid in a darkroom. They arrive quietly, almost invisibly, and it is only in their presence that the true image of your world begins to emerge from the blank paper of your days. For me, that moment was not a grand, cinematic event. It was a Tuesday night, lit only by the cold, blue-gray flicker of a muted television, with the weight of Julian's head in my lap. It was a weight I had grown to know intimately, a pressure that was both a profound comfort and a source of the most exquisite, unending anxiety. His breathing was a slow, deep current against the fabric of my jeans, a steady rhythm in the otherwise silent apartment, a sound that told me he was finally, truly asleep. The film we'd put on, some forgettable action movie full of explosions and noise, had ended an hour ago, but I hadn't moved. I couldn't. I had become a cartographer of these small details. The way a few strands of his dark hair curled just behind his ear, the faint, clean scent of his shampoo, the subtle twitch of his fingers against the couch cushion beside my leg. I was a man cataloging the geography of a country he was terrified he would never be allowed to visit again. This stillness, this casual, bone-deep intimacy, had become our ritual. It was a fragile architecture we had built in the ruins of his last relationship, a shelter made of unspoken things. And in the quiet of my living room, with the city humming a distant lullaby outside my window, I would sit and trace the lines of this new reality, trying to understand its structure. I would wonder if this closeness was a bridge he was building toward me, or if I was merely the foundation for a bridge he would eventually build to someone else. The hope that it was the former was a dangerous, living thing inside my chest, a tiny, feral bird I was trying to keep caged. I was a photographer by trade, a life spent in observation, in waiting for the perfect confluence of light and shadow to reveal a hidden truth. I knew how to be patient. I had been patient with my feelings for Julian for nearly a decade, but this new proximity felt different. It felt like holding a developing photograph in my hands, watching the image slowly, agonizingly resolve, terrified that the slightest mistake, the wrong chemical, the slightest tremble, would ruin it forever. And so I sat, perfectly still, a statue of feigned nonchalance, while the world I had so carefully contained threatened to either blossom or collapse around me. It hadn't always been like this. For 8 years, the architecture of our friendship was well-defined, with clear boundaries and load-bearing walls of platonic affection that I had meticulously reinforced from my side. We met in college, 2 freshmen adrift in the overwhelming sea of a new life, connected by the scent of chlorine and the punishing schedule of the university swim team. Julian was the sun around which our small team orbited. He was all blinding smiles and effortless charisma, the kind of person who seemed to generate his own light. He moved through the world with an uncomplicated grace that I, with my quiet corners and watchful eyes, found both mesmerizing and intimidating. He was the splash, the roar of the crowd, the explosive energy off the starting block. I was the silence underwater, the focused pull, the quiet observer at the edge of the pool with my battered waterproof camera, trying to capture the poetry in all that motion. Our friendship formed in the spaces between the intense physicality of our sport. It was forged during long bus rides to away meets, over greasy diner breakfasts after morning practice, and in the hushed halls of the library where he'd coax me into study groups. He had a way of pulling me into his light, of making my quietness feel not like a deficit but a point of gravity. He never pushed me to be more talkative or outgoing. Instead, he seemed to appreciate the stillness I offered, a port in the constant storm of his own social energy. He would talk for hours about his classes, his family, the intricate politics of the team, and I would listen, offering a thought here and there, but mostly just providing a space for him to simply be. I became his sounding board, his anchor. He once told me, laughing, that talking to me was like thinking out loud but getting better results. For him, it was an easy, natural bond. For me, it was something far more complicated. I can pinpoint the exact moment the developer fluid first touched the paper. It was sophomore year, at the conference championships. Julian had just finished the final leg of a relay. anchoring our team to a surprise victory. He'd hauled himself out of the pool, chest heaving, water streaming from his hair, and the roar of the crowd was deafening. But he wasn't looking at them. His eyes found mine across the deck, where I stood with my camera. And in that moment, stripped of his usual buoyant charm, he just looked exhausted and overwhelmingly, beautifully vulnerable. He gave me a small, private smile that was just for me, a flicker of genuine connection in the midst of the chaos. It was then that the carefully constructed walls of my affection began to show cracks. It was a seismic shift, subtle and internal, a realization that settled into my bones with the quiet, undeniable weight of truth. The feeling wasn't a choice. It was a fact, like the pull of gravity or the color of the sky. I was in love with my best friend. And so began the long, silent work of containment. I treated my feelings like a classified secret, building a fortress around them made of supportive smiles, casual shoulder pats, and carefully curated nonchalance. My heart became a locked room, and the key was thrown into the deepest part of the ocean I could imagine. To risk the friendship, to shatter the easy comfort he found with me, was unthinkable. Julian's friendship was a foundational part of my life, a pillar I couldn't bear to lose. So I learned to live with the quiet ache, the low hum of longing that became the soundtrack to my days. I became an expert in the art of loving from a safe distance, of admiring a masterpiece from behind the velvet rope. I was the trusted confidant, the one he came to for advice about the string of girlfriends who drifted in and out of his life. Each one was a small, sharp pain, a fresh reminder of the unbridgeable distance between us. I would listen to him talk about them, about first dates and arguments and anniversaries, and I would offer the best advice I could, my own heart breaking quietly in the background. It was a unique and exquisite form of self-inflicted torture. The longest and most serious of these was Sarah. She was kind and smart and beautiful, and for 3 years, she and Julian built a life together. I liked her, genuinely, which only made it harder. I watched them from the sidelines, the perfect, supportive friend, documenting their happiness with my camera at birthday parties and holiday gatherings. I took beautiful photos of them, freezing their love in silver gelatin, all the while feeling like a ghost at the feast. I told myself that his happiness was enough, that as long as he was happy, I could endure the silence of my own locked room. I almost believed it. Our dynamic was a study in contrast that somehow found a perfect, symbiotic balance. Julian was kinetic energy, a man of action and forward momentum, a software engineer who built logical systems and solved complex problems with elegant code. His world was one of definite answers and clear outcomes. I was potential energy, a man of observation and stillness. My world, the world of photography, was about capturing ambiguity, emotion, and the truths that existed in the gray spaces between light and shadow. He pushed me to try new things, to step out from behind the lens, while I provided him a space where he didn't have to perform, where he could be quiet and unstructured. We were two halves of a whole, a truth that seemed obvious to me, but one I was certain he would never see. The friendship was a masterpiece of my own creation, a carefully balanced composition, and I was its fiercely protective and deeply lonely curator. The first tremor that threatened this entire structure came not as a shout, but as a fractured whisper over the phone. It was a rainy Thursday in October, the kind of day where the city seemed to sigh under a blanket of gray mist. I was in my darkroom, the scent of fixer sharp in the air, watching an image of a deserted city street emerge in the developing tray, when my phone, left on the counter outside, began to vibrate. I almost ignored it. The darkroom was my sanctuary, a place of deliberate, methodical peace. But the buzzing was insistent, and a strange, unnameable anxiety pricked at me. Wiping my hands, I stepped out into the dim light of my apartment and saw Julian's name on the screen. I answered with a casual, "Hey, what's up?" And the sound that came back was one I had never heard from him before. His voice was hollowed out, a fragile, brittle thing. "Leo," he said, and his name was a shard of glass. Sarah left, just those 3 words, but they carried the weight of a collapsing building. All the air went out of my lungs. I could hear the cavernous silence of his empty apartment through the phone, a space that for 3 years had been filled with their shared life. He tried to say more, but his voice broke, dissolving into a ragged, choked sound. There was nothing I could say that would fix it, no logical code I could write to solve this problem. So I fell back on the one thing I could offer: my presence. "Stay there," I said, my voice softer than I intended. "I'm coming over." An hour later, he was at my door. I had called him back and told him to come to my place instead, that he shouldn't be alone in that apartment full of ghosts. He stood on my doorstep, soaked from the relentless autumn rain, his hair plastered to his forehead. He looked smaller than I had ever seen him, his usual vibrant energy extinguished, leaving behind a profound emptiness. He wasn't just sad. He was lost, a ship whose anchor had been cut loose in a storm. He carried a single duffel bag, as if he were a refugee fleeing a war zone, which, in a way, he was. He didn't say anything as he stepped inside. He just walked to the center of my living room and stood there, dripping onto the hardwood floor, his shoulders slumped in defeat. I took his wet jacket and hung it up, made him a cup of tea he didn't touch, and then we just sat on the couch in a silence that was heavy with everything he couldn't say. That first night, he talked in broken fragments, piecing together the narrative of the end. It wasn't a dramatic, explosive fight, but a slow, quiet erosion. She had fallen out of love with him. A simple, brutal, and irreparable fact. He spoke with a kind of dazed disbelief, as if recounting a story that had happened to someone else. I just listened, a quiet sentinel in the dim light, my heart aching with a terrible, conflicting mix of sympathy for his pain and a shameful, secret flicker of something else. Something I immediately buried. As the night deepened, his words trailed off, replaced by a weary exhaustion. He eventually fell asleep right there on the couch, sitting upright, his head lolling to one side. I watched him for a long time, this brilliant, broken man, and gently eased him down so he was lying flat, pulling the Afghan from the back of the chair over him. I felt a powerful, protective urge, a desire to stand guard over his sleep, to shield him from the wreckage of his life. The tectonic plates of our friendship were shifting, and I could feel the ground moving beneath my feet. A new, uncertain landscape was beginning to form, and I was terrified of the mountains and valleys it might create. The days that followed blurred into a routine of quiet support. Julian stayed on my couch, a temporary arrangement that stretched from one night into a week, then two. He was a ghost in my apartment, moving through the rooms with a listless energy, the vibrant color leached out of him. We fell into a pattern. I would wake early to find him already awake, staring out the window at the city below, a mug of coffee growing cold in his hands. We'd eat meals in near silence. In the evenings, we'd put on movies, not for the stories they told, but for the noise they made, a welcome distraction from the deafening sound of his grief. It was during one of these movie nights, about 3 weeks after the breakup, that the first, almost imperceptible boundary was crossed. We were watching some mindless comedy, sitting on opposite ends of the couch as we always did, a carefully maintained buffer of 3 cushions between us. Julian hadn't laughed once. He just stared at the screen, his gaze distant. He was exhausted, not just from lack of sleep, but from the sheer emotional labor of grieving. I saw his eyelids begin to droop, his head nodding forward before he'd jerk it back up. Then, without any warning, his body seemed to give up the fight. He slumped sideways, and his head came to rest against my shoulder. My entire body went rigid. I stopped breathing. It was the most casual of gestures, a simple, unconscious act of seeking comfort. But to me, it felt like a lightning strike. Every nerve ending in my body was suddenly on high alert, screamingly aware of the solid weight of him. The warmth of his cheek through the thin fabric of my t-shirt, the soft brush of his hair against my neck. I sat there, frozen, for what felt like an eternity, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My mind raced, trying to decode the meaning of this simple act. Was it a mistake? Was he so asleep he didn't realize what he'd done? Should I move? Should I gently push him away? But I couldn't. Some part of me, the part one had kept locked away for so long, refused to let me. It was a silent, desperate plea for comfort, and I was incapable of denying him. After a few minutes, his breathing evened out into the slow, deep rhythm of sleep, and I finally, cautiously, allowed myself to relax. I let my own head rest back against the couch, the side of his head now nestled firmly in the curve of my shoulder and neck. It was terrifying, and it was, without a doubt, the most profoundly wonderful feeling I had ever experienced. I didn't move until the credits rolled and the screen went black, leaving us in the quiet dark. That night was the beginning of the ritual. The act, once done, became easier to repeat. The next night, he didn't wait to fall asleep. We sat down to watch a movie, and after a few minutes of silence, he just shifted over and rested his head on my shoulder as if it were the most natural thing in the world. He offered no explanation, and I asked for none. We had entered a new, unspoken agreement. The three-cushion buffer zone was officially dissolved. From there, the progression was slow, a gradual erosion of the remaining space between us. A week later, he was tired after a long day of apartment hunting, and he stretched out on the couch, laying his head in my lap without a word. The first time he did it, I felt that same jolt of panic and pleasure, my hands hovering awkwardly in the air, unsure of where to put them. Eventually, tentatively, I rested one hand on his shoulder. The next time, my fingers found their way into his hair, a gesture of such startling intimacy that it made my breath catch in my throat. He sighed softly in his sleep and leaned into the touch. Our evenings became the focal point of my existence. I would go through my days, shooting assignments, editing photos, meeting with clients, in a state of suspended animation, waiting for the moment he would walk through the door, shed the weight of his day, and gravitate toward the couch, toward me. It became our sanctuary, a bubble of quiet comfort in the heart of the city. The pretexts grew thinner and thinner. We'd say we were going to watch a movie, but often the television would remain off. We would just sit, him resting against me, the silence filled only by the sound of our breathing. It was a fragile, liminal space, somewhere between friendship and something more, and I was terrified of naming it, terrified that giving it a name would cause it to vanish. My internal world during this time was a battlefield. Hope and fear were locked in a constant, brutal war. Every time he sought me out for comfort, every time his hand brushed against mine on the couch, every time he mumbled my name in his sleep, the hope would surge, a brilliant, blinding wave. This has to mean something, it would scream. This isn't just friendship. But then fear, my old, cautious companion, would counter with its cold, relentless logic. He's grieving. He's lonely. You are a safe harbor, a convenient stand-in for the physical affection he lost. Don't mistake a life raft for a destination. You are a placeholder, a temporary comfort. To mistake this for more is to guarantee your own heartbreak. I analyzed every gesture, every sigh, every glance, searching for clues, for evidence to support one side or the other. I was a detective investigating the crime of my own heart, and the evidence was maddeningly, beautifully ambiguous. I started thinking of my feelings in photographic terms. For years, my love for him had been an underexposed negative, a latent image hidden in the dark, full of potential but invisible to the naked eye. Now, it felt as if we were in the darkroom together. His grief, his need for comfort, was the developer fluid, and the image was slowly, painfully, emerging. I could see the outlines of something new, something I had only ever dreamed of. But I was terrified of the final step. I was terrified of the fixer, the chemical that would make the image permanent, because I didn't know what that image would be. Would it be a portrait of two people finding each other? Or a stark, heartbreaking picture of one-sided love, a permanent record of my own foolish hope? The uncertainty was a constant, low-grade fever. Sometimes, the intimacy was so profound it was almost unbearable. There were nights he'd be plagued by nightmares, his body tensing in his sleep, a low whimper escaping his lips. In those moments, I would instinctively tighten my hold, murmuring his name softly until the tension bled out of him and he settled back into a peaceful sleep. He never seemed to remember these episodes in the morning, but they stayed with me, tiny, secret acts of caretaking that deepened the bond one felt, making the lines between friend and something more blur into non-existence. His hand would sometimes find mine as he slept, his fingers lacing through mine with an unconscious, trusting familiarity that made my heart ache. I would lie awake for hours on those nights, staring at our joined hands in the dim light, feeling the gentle pressure of his pulse against my own, and wonder how it was possible to feel so completely happy and so utterly terrified at the same time. The bubble we had created felt so real, so sacred, but I was always aware of the world outside, waiting to burst it. A text from a mutual friend asking how Julian was doing, a call from his mother that he'd take in the other room, his voice strained. These small intrusions were reminders that our quiet ritual was an anomaly, a temporary state of being that couldn't last forever. Sooner or later, he would heal. He would move into his new apartment. He would start dating again. And where would that leave me? The thought was a cold knot of dread in my stomach. I was living on borrowed time, in a borrowed intimacy, and I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that when it ended, the silence in my apartment would be more profound than it had ever been before. The night that everything changed began like any other. It was a Saturday, cold and clear, the first real bite of winter in the air. Julian had spent the day moving the last of his things into his new apartment, a small one-bedroom, placed a dozen blocks from mine. It was a significant step, a tangible move toward his new, independent life, and a quiet dread had been my shadow all day. He arrived at my door around 8, looking tired but relieved. He brought pizza, our unspoken tradition. We ate on the floor, leaning against the couch, talking about the mundane details of his move, the finicky radiator, the lack of water pressure. The conversation was easy, normal, but underneath it, I felt a new tension, a new awareness of the impending end of our arrangement. This was one of the last nights. Soon, he would be settled in his own space. Soon, the ritual would have no reason to exist. After we ate, we migrated to the couch. The television remained off. The silence that settled between us was different this time. It wasn't the comfortable, easy silence we had grown accustomed to. This silence was heavy, charged with unspoken words. It felt like the air before a storm, thick with ozone and a palpable sense of anticipation. Julian stretched out, his head finding its familiar place in my lap, but he didn't close his eyes. He just stared up at the ceiling, his brow furrowed in thought. I rested my hand on his chest, a gesture that had become second nature, and I could feel the steady, strong beat of his heart beneath my palm. It was a rhythm I knew as well as my own. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The only sounds were the distant wail of a siren and the frantic thrumming of my own pulse in my ears. I was acutely aware of every point of contact between us, the warmth of his body, the weight of his head, the rise and fall of his chest with each breath. Then he shifted. He pushed himself up onto one elbow, breaking the comfortable configuration. The sudden loss of his weight was a physical shock. He turned to face me, his body now angled toward mine on the couch. The space between us was no more than a few inches, and in the dim light filtering in from the street, I could see the conflict in his eyes. He looked uncertain, vulnerable, and deeply serious. My breath caught in my chest. This was it. This was the moment the photograph would be fixed, for better or for worse. Leo. His voice was barely a whisper, a rough, hesitant sound that was swallowed by the silence of the room. I couldn't find my own voice. I could only look at him, my heart feeling like it was trying to beat its way out of my ribcage. I managed a small, almost imperceptible nod. He swallowed, his gaze holding mine. "Can I ask you something?" Again, I just nodded, my throat tight with a terrifying mixture of hope and dread. This was the precipice. I could feel the ground crumbling away beneath me. He seemed to be wrestling with the words, searching for the right ones. He took a breath, a shaky, uncertain thing. "Would it be okay?" he started, his voice cracking slightly on the last word. He paused, his eyes searching my face for a sign, for permission or rejection. The seconds stretched, taut and crystalline. "If I kissed you?" The question hung in the air between us, a fragile, impossible thing. It was not a proposition, not a confident advance. It was a plea. It was the most vulnerable I had ever seen him, stripped bare of all his easy charm, offering up his own uncertainty as a gift. In that moment, the war inside me ceased. The cynical voice of fear was silenced, utterly vanquished by the sheer, terrifying beauty of his honesty. All the years of silent longing, of carefully guarded feelings, of patient waiting, coalesced into this single, perfect point in time. The world narrowed to his eyes, his question, and the breath I was holding in my lungs. I felt a slow, incredible wave of relief wash over me, so profound it was almost painful. The image in the developer was clear. It was beautiful. A single word was all that was required, all I could manage. It came out as a soft, breathy sound, full of a decade of unspoken emotion. Yes, he leaned in slowly, giving me every possible chance to pull away, to change my mind. I didn't. I met him halfway, closing the final, infinitesimal distance between us. The first touch of his lips to mine was not a spark, not an explosion. It was quieter than that, and infinitely more profound. It was a question and an answer all at once. It was tentative, soft, and breathtakingly gentle. It was a kiss of discovery, of hesitant confirmation, tasting of salt and pizza, and a loneliness so deep it had taken us both years to finally name it. It was the feeling of coming home to a place you never knew you had been searching for. In the quiet of my living room, with the city lights painting patterns on the wall, the world I had known was irrevocably and beautifully altered. The aftermath of the kiss was a strange and delicate piece. We didn't talk. Words felt clumsy and inadequate, blunt instruments for something so nuanced. We just stayed there on the couch, shifting into a new configuration, my arm around his shoulders, his head resting on my chest, his hand covering mine where it lay over his heart. He fell asleep like that, and for the first time, there was no anxiety in his presence, no question mark hanging over us. There was only a quiet, overwhelming sense of rightness. I stayed awake long after he was asleep, replaying the moment over and over in my mind, committing every detail to memory, branding it onto my soul. The fear that had been my constant companion for so long had been replaced by a fragile, luminous hope that felt as real and solid as the man sleeping in my arms. The morning light that filtered through my blinds felt different, softer. It illuminated a world that had been fundamentally rearranged. I woke to find Julian already awake, propped up on his elbows, looking at me. For a moment, I saw the same gentle vulnerability from the night before in his eyes, and my heart swelled. I smiled, a real, unguarded smile. But his expression was unreadable. It wasn't cold, not exactly, but a shutter had come down. The openness was gone, replaced by a guarded tension. He didn't smile back. "I should go," he said, his voice quiet and strained. He sat up, swinging his legs off the couch and pointedly not looking at me. The easy intimacy of the night before evaporated like mist in the morning sun. "Julian," I asked, my own voice laced with a confusion that was rapidly souring into dread. "Is everything okay?" "Yeah, I have an early meeting I forgot about," he mumbled, already pulling on his shoes. It was the flimsiest of excuses. It was Sunday. The knot of dread in my stomach tightened. He grabbed his jacket, still avoiding my gaze. He walked to the door and paused, his hand on the knob. He finally turned to look at me, and his expression was a cocktail of panic and apology. "Leo, last night was a mistake. I'm sorry," and then he was gone. The door clicked shut behind him, the sound echoing in the suddenly vast, empty apartment. I just sat there, frozen on the couch, the word mistake ringing in my ears. A mistake. The beautiful, clear image from the night before dissolved into a chaotic, painful blur. The fixer had been poisoned. The photograph was ruined. All the old fears I thought had been vanquished came rushing back, a tidal wave of icy cynicism. He was lonely. He was confused. I was convenient. I had let myself believe, for a few short hours, that it was real. The shame and hurt were so intense they felt like a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I had been a fool. The next few days were a special kind of hell, a limbo of silence. My apartment, which had been a sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, every surface haunted by his absence. The indentation on the couch cushion where his head used to rest was a cruel monument to my own stupidity. I replayed his final words. Last night was a mistake, dissecting them, trying to find another meaning, another interpretation, but there was none. It was a clear, brutal rejection. My texts to him went either unanswered or received short, functional replies. Can't talk. Busy later, he was building a wall between us, brick by painful brick, and I was on the outside, watching it grow taller. The friendship I had guarded so fiercely for years, the very thing I had been terrified of losing, seemed to be disintegrating before my eyes. The risk I had finally allowed myself to feel good about had backfired in the most spectacular way possible. After 3 days of this agonizing silence, something inside me shifted. The hurt was still there, a raw, open wound, but it was slowly being overtaken by a cold, simmering anger. Anger at him, for his cowardice, for making me feel like a dirty secret, and anger at myself, for letting him. I couldn't live in this silent, agonizing space. I couldn't let him erase what had happened, to reduce something that had felt so profound to a mistake, and then just walk away. If our friendship was truly over, it would not end with a whimper. It would end with the truth. Fueled by a desperate, reckless energy, I grabbed my keys and walked out of my apartment, my destination clear. I was going to his new place. I was going to force him to look at me and tell me, to my face, what had happened. When he opened the door, he looked genuinely shocked to see me, as if I were a ghost from a past life. His apartment was a chaotic landscape of unpacked boxes and bare walls. He looked tired, his eyes shadowed with sleeplessness. He tried to form an excuse, something about being busy unpacking, but I cut him off. "Don't, Julian," I said, my voice dangerously quiet but steady. "Don't you dare hide from me. We need to talk." I stepped past him into the apartment, forcing the confrontation. The air was thick with tension. He finally closed the door, leaning his back against it with a sigh of resignation. He still wouldn't meet my eyes. He stared at a stack of books on the floor, as if they held the answers to the universe. "Leo, I already said I was sorry. I was messed up. I wasn't thinking clearly. I repeated, the words tasting like acid. "Is that what you call it?" Because from where I was sitting, it felt like the first time in months you were actually present. It felt like the first time you were actually honest. My voice started to rise, fueled by days of suppressed pain. "So you get to just use me? You get to take all the comfort and intimacy you need while you're grieving, and then the second it becomes something real, you call it a mistake and run?" Was I a mistake, Julian? Was holding my hand a mistake? Was sleeping in my arms for a month a mistake? Or was it just the kiss? Was that the one part that was too much for you? My words hit their mark. He flinched as if I had physically struck him. He finally looked at me, and his eyes were filled with a raw, desperate panic. "I don't know," he finally burst out, his voice cracking with the strain. "Okay, I don't know. It's never been with a guy." He ran a hand through his hair, pacing the small space between the boxes. "All I know is that it felt right. It felt more right than anything has in years. And that terrifies me, Leo. It terrifies me because I don't know what it means. About me. About us." He stopped pacing and stood before me, his defenses finally crumbling. The anger drained out of me, replaced by a profound, aching sadness for both of us. He looked so lost. "Our friendship is the most important thing in my life," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. And I felt like I was about to destroy it. I felt like I was going to wreck the one good thing I have left. So I ran. Because I'm a coward. "And I'm so sorry I hurt you." The confession, raw and unfiltered, hung in the air between us. He wasn't rejecting me. He was terrified. He wasn't running from me. He was running from himself, from a feeling so new and powerful it had completely unmoored him from the person he thought he was. All the walls he had thrown up in the last few days came crashing down, revealing the same scared, vulnerable man I had held on my couch. The anger was gone. The hurt was still there, but it was now tempered with a deep, compassionate understanding. We were both just standing in the rubble, trying to figure out what to do next. That conversation in his half-empty apartment was the hardest one we ever had, and the most necessary. We talked for hours, surrounded by the ghosts of his old life and the uncertain potential of a new one. We laid everything bare. I told him about the years of silent affection, about the careful walls I had built to protect our friendship, and the agony of watching him with other people. He listened, his expression a mixture of shock, regret, and a dawning understanding. He told me about his own confusion, about the slow, subconscious shift in how he saw me. He admitted that the comfort he found with me was different, deeper than anything he'd felt with Sarah, a realization that had unsettled him long before the kiss. He hadn't had the language for it, the framework to understand it, so he had ignored it. The kiss hadn't created the feeling. It had simply forced him to finally name it. There were no easy answers or grand declarations. It was messy and complicated and frightening, but it was honest. By the time the sun began to set, casting long shadows through the bare windows, a fragile truce had been declared. We agreed on one thing. We didn't want to lose each other. We decided to take a step back, not to the old friendship, which was a place we could never truly return to, but to a new, deliberate space. A space where we could figure things out, together, without pressure or expectation. We decided to start again, not as friends, not as lovers, but as two people choosing to navigate an unknown territory, with honesty as our only compass. The weeks that followed were a study in tentative grace. We rebuilt our connection slowly, carefully, like assembling a delicate piece of machinery. The easy, unconscious intimacy was gone, replaced by a conscious, intentional closeness. A simple touch of the hand was no longer an accident. It was a choice, a quiet statement. We went for long walks, exploring the city, talking about everything and nothing. I helped him unpack his boxes, and we slowly turned his empty apartment into a home. We were learning a new language together, one where a shared glance across a room could hold an entire conversation, where a small smile could convey more than a lengthy monologue. One evening, about a month after our talk, he came over to my place for dinner. After we ate, we found ourselves on the couch, a familiar setting with an entirely new emotional charge. The space between us felt vast. He looked at me, a question in his eyes. I just smiled and patted the cushion beside me. He moved closer, and this time, when he rested his head on my shoulder, it was not an act of unconscious need, but a deliberate, trusting choice. I wrapped my arm around him, and he took my other hand, lacing his fingers through mine. There was no ambiguity, no fear, no hidden meaning. It was just a simple, profound truth. This was where we belonged. He tilted his head up and kissed me, softly and with a quiet certainty that spoke volumes. It wasn't a question anymore. It was a statement. Our new normal was quiet, undramatic, and more wonderful than anything I could have ever allowed myself to imagine. It was built of small, domestic moments. Making coffee together in the morning, the comfortable silence of reading in the same room, him watching me work in my darkroom, fascinated by the magic of the process. The darkroom became our space. The dim, red safety light created a world apart, a sanctuary where the only things that mattered were the images taking shape in the chemical baths and the quiet presence of each other. One night, he was with me as I developed a series of portraits I had taken of him in the weeks since our talk. He watched, mesmerized, as his own face began to emerge on the paper, floating up from the white expanse. The Julian in these photos was different from the one I had photographed for years. The easy, performative smile was gone. In its place was a quieter, more thoughtful expression, a vulnerability and a strength that had always been there, but that I was only now able to truly capture. He pointed to the print hanging from the line to dry. "What do you see?" he asked, his voice soft in the quiet room. "When you look at that." I looked from the portrait to his face, illuminated by the soft red glow. I thought of all the years of watching him from a distance, of the painful journey we had taken to get to this small, quiet room. I thought of the underexposed negatives, the fear of the developer, the terror of the poisoned fixer. And I thought of the beautiful, permanent image we were now creating together. "I see you," I said, my voice full of a feeling I no longer had to hide. I see everything that was always there, finally coming into the light. We learn, eventually, that the most important structures in our lives are not built of wood or stone, but of moments and choices. We build our homes in other people. For years, my heart was a locked room I was afraid to enter. It took Julian, with his own brokenness and his unknowing, gentle persistence, to not break the door down, but to simply stand outside and wait until I was ready to hand him the key. And in the beautiful, honest silence we learned to create together, we didn't just find each other. We began to heal. We began to build a home.